The call came from a cafe I'd never heard of. A stranger's voice, low and urgent, said I needed to see footage. Something about my past. Something buried. They told me to come alone. They told me not to tell my husband. I should have asked questions. I should have hung up. But when you've spent your whole life sensing that something wasn't right, that the people closest to you were hiding things you were never meant to know, you don't ignore a call like that. You go, even when every instinct screams that crossing that threshold will change everything. I went, and what I saw on that screen shattered every truth I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and myself. My name is Laura Whitman, and this is my life. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches and everyone knew everyone. But nobody ever asked the questions that mattered. My mother, Evelyn Whitman, was a woman of few words. She had this way of watching people, really watching them, like she was reading a book only she could see. My father, Richard, died when I was 9 years old. They told me it was a highway accident. Foggy night, slick roads, wrong place at wrong time. The casket stayed closed at the funeral. So did every conversation about him after that day. But children notice things adults think they hide. I noticed the way my mother's hands shook when she sorted through the mail. I noticed how she'd pull the curtains tight every evening before the sun even set. I noticed the way certain songs on the radio made her leave the room without explanation. My father's death was supposed to be a tragedy we moved past, but it felt more like a weight we dragged behind us, invisible and suffocating. When I was 11, I came home from school early because of a fire drill that sent us all home. I walked into our backyard and saw my mother crouched by a metal drum, flames licking up toward the sky. She was burning photographs, boxes and boxes of them. I stood there frozen, watching the edges of faces curl and blacken, watching memories turn to ash. She didn't see me at first. When she finally did, she didn't explain. She just said, "Sometimes the past needs to stay in the past, Laura." Then she went inside and locked herself in her bedroom for the rest of the day. There were men too, men I didn't recognize. They'd show up at odd hours, always, when I was supposed to be at school or asleep. But I wasn't always where I was supposed to be. I'd see them from my bedroom window, talking to my mother on the porch, their voices low and urgent. They never stayed long. They never came inside, and they never said goodbye. One of them had a scar that ran from his ear to his collar. Another wore the same brown jacket every time, like it was a uniform. I asked my mother once who they were. She said they were old friends of my father's. When I asked what kind of friends, she told me to go do my homework. I tried to let it go. I tried to be the normal kid who played with dolls and did her times tables and didn't think too hard about the things adults refused to explain. But normal felt like a costume I was wearing, and it never quite fit. Then one afternoon when I was 12, everything shifted. I was homesick with a stomach bug, lying on the couch under a blanket, half asleep. The phone rang. My mother answered in the kitchen. I heard her voice drop to a whisper. I should have stayed on that couch. I should have closed my eyes and pretended I heard nothing. But I didn't. I crept to the doorway and listened. She said, "She doesn't remember. Keep it that way." There was a long pause. Then she said, "I know what I'm doing. She's safer not knowing." Another pause. "No, absolutely not. She's just a child." Her voice cracked on that last word. I stepped back, my heart pounding so hard I thought she'd hear it. But she didn't. She hung up the phone and stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. That night at dinner, I couldn't help myself. I looked at her across the table and asked, "Mom, who doesn't remember?" She dropped her fork. It clattered against her plate, loud in the silence. She looked at me like I'd just ripped open something that was supposed to stay buried. Her face went pale. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. Then finally, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she said, "Some truths wait until they're ready to hurt you, Laura." I didn't understand what she meant, not then, but I felt it, that cold finger of dread running down my spine. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something dark and deep, and if I leaned forward even an inch, I'd fall and never stop falling. I was 12 years old, and I already knew my mother was keeping secrets. What I didn't know was that I was one of them. In my 20s, I did what so many people do when they're trying to outrun their past. I ran, I packed 2 suitcases, kissed my mother on the cheek, and moved to Chicago without looking back. I told myself I was chasing opportunity, chasing independence, chasing a life that made sense. But really, I was running from questions I didn't know how to ask and answers I was terrified to hear. I became a freelance editor, the kind of work where you could disappear into other people's words and forget your own story for a while. I was good at it. I could fix broken sentences, untangle messy narratives, make chaos look clean on a page. If only I could have done the same for my own life. I met Daniel Whitman at a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday. He was sitting alone reviewing blueprints, his brow furrowed in concentration. I spilled my latte all over his table. He didn't get angry. He just smiled, helped me clean it up, and said, "At least it wasn't the structural plans." We started talking. He was a civil engineer, the kind of man who believed in measurements, calculations, and concrete answers. He loved order. He loved logic. He loved knowing exactly how things fit together. I loved that about him. I loved that he didn't ask about the parts of me that didn't make sense. 2 years later, we got married in a small ceremony with his family and a handful of friends. My mother didn't come. She said she had a cold, but her voice on the phone sounded fine. It sounded distant. Life in Chicago felt normal in a way Dayton never did. We had a small apartment in Lincoln Park with exposed brick and windows that let in too much light. Daniel worked long hours on infrastructure projects. I edited manuscripts from home, mostly memoirs and true crime, which I realize now was a strange choice given everything. We had routines. Friday dinners at the Thai place on the corner. Sunday mornings at the farmer's market. We had friends, the kind you make as adults, the kind that feel close but never quite reach the depths of what you're really thinking. Maya became my best friend without either of us really planning it. She worked at the same publishing house I freelanced for, and we bonded over bad coffee and worse client feedback. She was bold where I was cautious, loud where I was quiet. She asked questions I never would have asked. Then there was Tom, our neighbor in the apartment across the hall. He was friendly to the point of being intrusive, always popping by to borrow something or chat about nothing. Daniel liked him. I found him exhausting. Grace, Daniel's sister, was a criminal defense attorney with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. She didn't trust easily, and I always felt like she was studying me, looking for cracks in my story. Ellen was my therapist, someone I started seeing after a panic attack at a grocery store left me hyperventilating in the cereal aisle. And then there was Mark Rivera, a journalist I edited for occasionally. He wrote investigative pieces, the kind that dug into corruption and cover-ups. He had this way of asking follow-up questions that made you feel like he already knew the answer. I thought I'd built something solid. I thought I'd left the strangeness of my childhood behind like an old coat I'd outgrown, but my mother never visited. Not once. She'd call every few months, always at odd times, always with strange questions that felt like tests. "Are you happy, Laura? Or just comfortable?" she asked once. I didn't know how to answer. Another time she said, "Does Daniel ever leave his phone face down?" I laughed and said, "What kind of question is that?" She didn't laugh back. She just said, "Just asking," but it didn't feel like just asking. It felt like she was checking on something, looking for something, waiting for something. The strangest call came on a Thursday evening. I was chopping vegetables for dinner when my phone rang. My mother's voice was tight, almost panicked. She said, "Laura, if anyone ever asks you to meet alone, call me first. Don't go. Don't trust it. Call me." I asked her what she was talking about. She said, "Just promise me." I promised because it was easier than arguing. I hung up and told Daniel about it. He shrugged and said, "Your mom's always been a little paranoid, hasn't she?" I nodded, but I didn't believe it. Paranoia has a reason. I just didn't know what hers was. Then one afternoon in late September, everything changed. I was sitting at my desk editing a manuscript about a woman who'd survived an abusive marriage when my phone rang. The screen said blocked number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice, low and gravelly, said, "Laura Whitman." I said yes. He said, "Your mother doesn't know we found it, but you need to see the footage." My heart stopped. I said, "What footage? Who is this?" But the line was already dead. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking, my mind racing. Found what? What footage? Who was we? That night, my mother called for the first time in months. She was already crying. My mother's voice was shaking so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said, "Laura, the cafe called." I laughed, this nervous, breathless sound that didn't feel like it came from me. I said, "What cafe, Mom? What are you talking about?" There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that feels like the world is holding its breath. Then she swallowed hard, and I heard it through the phone, that thick, painful sound. She said the words that still echo in my head every single day. They said, "You need to see the footage. Come alone. Don't tell your husband." My entire body went cold. I gripped the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. I said, "Mom, what footage? Who called you?" She let out this broken sob, the kind that sounds like it's been trapped inside someone for years. She said, "I prayed you'd never hear that sentence, Laura. I prayed every single day that you'd never have to." I could hear her breathing, ragged and uneven. I said, "You need to tell me what's going on. Right now, and for the first time in my entire life, my mother told me the truth, or at least part of it. She said my father didn't die in an accident." She said it so quietly, I almost didn't hear it, but once the words were out, they filled the room like smoke. Richard Whitman wasn't killed by fog and slick roads. He was investigating something. Not a company, not a scandal in the traditional sense. People, dangerous people. People who didn't want to be found. She said he'd been gathering evidence, documenting things that were supposed to stay hidden. And Ridgeway Café, a place I'd never even heard of, was a drop point. A place where people exchanged information without leaving trails, without names, without records. My father had used it, and now someone was using it to reach me. I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. I said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" She said, "Because knowing would have put you in danger. Because I thought if I kept you far enough away from it, you'd be safe." Her voice cracked. "I thought I could protect you." I asked her what was on the footage. She said she didn't know. But if someone was reaching out now, after all these years, it meant the past didn't stay buried the way she thought it had. It meant something had surfaced. Something that involved me. She begged me not to go. She said, "Laura, please don't do this. Let it stay buried. Let it stay in the past where it belongs." But even as she said it, I could hear the resignation in her voice. She knew I was going to go. She knew because she would have done the same thing. I asked her if she thought it was dangerous. She said, "I think everything about this has always been dangerous." Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "If they found you, it means someone wants you to know. And people like that don't give information for free." I didn't tell Daniel. I couldn't. How do you explain to your husband, the man who builds bridges and believes in structural integrity, that your dead father was involved in something shadowy and now strangers are contacting you with cryptic warnings? How do you tell him that your entire childhood was built on lies and that you're about to walk into something you don't understand? I couldn't, so I lied. I told Maya I had a dentist appointment. Something routine, nothing to worry about. I left my phone at home on the kitchen counter, face up, like I had nothing to hide. Daniel was at work. He wouldn't notice I was gone. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove. Ridgeway Café was on the south side of the city, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. It was the kind of place you'd walk past 100 times and never notice. The windows were tinted. The sign was faded. I sat in my car for 10 minutes staring at the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I kept thinking about my mother's voice, about the way she'd said, "Come alone." I kept thinking about the man on the phone, about the footage I was supposed to see. I kept thinking about my father, who I barely remembered, who died when I was too young to ask the right questions. Finally, I got out of the car. I walked across the street. I pushed open the door. The cafe was nearly empty. A few people sat in corners, nursing coffee, not looking up. The air smelled like burnt espresso and something else. Something stale and heavy. I walked to the counter. The barista was a woman, mid-50s with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. She looked at me, and I watched recognition flash across her face. She didn't smile. She didn't ask what I wanted. She just said, in a voice that was calm and certain, "You're Evelyn's daughter? We've been waiting." The cafe manager introduced himself as Henry Blake. He didn't shake my hand. He just nodded toward a narrow hallway at the back of the cafe and said, "Follow me." My legs felt like they weren't my own as I walked behind him. We passed a storage room stacked with boxes, a bathroom with a flickering light, and then we reached a small office that smelled like dust and old paper. There was a desk, a filing cabinet, and an old security monitor that looked like it belonged in a museum. Henry closed the door behind us. He didn't ask if I was ready. He just pressed play. The footage was grainy, the kind of quality you get from old surveillance cameras that nobody ever bothered to upgrade. The timestamp in the corner read April 14th, 1996. I would have been 6 years old. The camera showed the interior of the cafe, or at least what it looked like back then. Different tables, different layout, but the same heavy air. And then I saw her, my mother, young, maybe 30, with long dark hair and a face tight with fear. She was sitting at a corner table, clutching a folder against her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her alive. A man approached her, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. I couldn't see his face clearly. She handed him the folder. He took it without a word, and then he left. I was about to ask Henry why he was showing me this, when the camera angle shifted. The footage jumped to a different view, one that captured the entrance and part of the main seating area. And that's when I saw him. My husband Daniel, not an older version, not a younger version. The exact same face, the same posture, the same way he stands with his weight slightly on his left leg. He was standing near the door, half hidden by a column, watching my mother, watching the exchange, watching everything. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was caving in. I said, "That's not possible." My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded small and broken. Henry didn't respond. He pressed a button and the screen changed. Another date, June 1998. Different camera, same cafe, and there he was again. Daniel, same face, same man, standing in the background, a newspaper in his hands, but his eyes were on someone at the counter. I couldn't see who. The footage was too grainy, but he was there. Henry pressed the button again. October 2001. A third tape. Daniel again. This time sitting at a table near the window, his back to the camera. But I knew that posture. I knew the way he held his shoulders. I knew him. Henry finally spoke. He said, "That man appears in 3 separate tapes. Different years, same face. We've been archiving footage from this location since 1994. Your father started the system. He wanted proof, evidence, a trail that couldn't be erased." I turned to look at Henry, tears streaming down my face without me even realizing I was crying. I said, "That's my husband. That's Daniel." Henry's expression didn't change. He said, "I know." I screamed. I actually screamed. I said it was impossible. I said Daniel would have been a teenager in 1996. I said he didn't even know who I was back then. I said there had to be a mistake, a glitch, someone who looked like him. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. That was Daniel. I knew his face better than I knew my own. Henry handed me a flash drive. He said, "Take this. Don't watch it here. Don't watch it anywhere someone else can see." I took it with shaking hands. I asked him who he was, why he was doing this, what any of this meant. He said, "Your father trusted the wrong people, and your mother spent the last 25 years trying to keep you away from them, but they found you anyway." I asked who they were. He said, "I think you're starting to figure that out." I drove home in a daze. I don't remember the route I took. I don't remember stopping at red lights or merging onto the highway. I just remember gripping the steering wheel so hard, my hands ached and trying not to scream. When I pulled into our parking garage, I sat in the car for 20 minutes, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, trying to convince myself there was an explanation. There had to be an explanation. Daniel was home early. I walked into the apartment and found him in the kitchen pouring a glass of water. He smiled when he saw me. That same warm, easy smile I'd fallen in love with. He said, "Hey, how was the dentist?" I forced myself to smile back. I said, "Fine, just a cleaning." He walked over and kissed my forehead. Then he paused. He tilted his head slightly and said, "Why does your car smell like old coffee?" in panic. I froze. I said, "What?" He said, "I went down to grab something from the trunk earlier. The whole car smells weird." "Where were you really?" I told him I stopped at a cafe after the dentist. I told him I needed to clear my head. He studied my face for a long moment, and I couldn't tell if he believed me or not. Then he just nodded and said, "Okay." But something in his voice felt wrong. Something in the way he looked at me felt different. Like he was calculating, like he was deciding something that night. I couldn't sleep. Daniel was next to me, breathing slow and steady, and I kept thinking about the footage, about his face in 1996, about the way he'd watched my mother, about the lies I'd been living inside without even knowing it. Around 2 a.m, I got up. I told myself I was just getting water, but instead, I walked into the living room. Daniel's laptop was open on the coffee table. He never left it open. Never. I looked back toward the bedroom. The door was closed. I could still hear him breathing. I sat down. I moved the mouse. The screen lit up. There were files I didn't recognize, folders with names that meant nothing to me. And then I saw it. One folder labeled Whitman, E.L., Evelyn, Laura, my mother. Me, I opened it. Inside were documents, photos, surveillance logs, and videos. So many videos. I clicked on one. The timestamp was from earlier that same day. The footage showed me walking into Ridgeway Cafe, sitting in my car beforehand, talking to Henry, leaving with the flash drive. Someone had been watching me, and that someone had sent the footage to Daniel. I confronted my mother the next morning. I didn't call first. I didn't warn her. I just got in my car at 6 a.m., drove 4 hours straight to Dayton, and walked into her house using the key she'd given me years ago that I'd never used. She was in the kitchen making coffee, and when she saw me, the mug in her hand slipped. It shattered on the floor, ceramic pieces scattering everywhere, but neither of us moved to clean it up. I said, "Tell me everything right now. No more lies. No more protecting me. Tell me who Daniel is." She looked at me for a long time, and I watched something break behind her eyes. Some final wall she'd been holding up for decades. She sat down at the kitchen table, and I sat across from her, and she told me everything. My father, Richard Whitman, worked undercover, not for one agency but for several, depending on who needed what and when. He investigated people who operated outside the law, people who had enough money and power to make entire lives disappear. He documented everything. He was meticulous, and he was good at it. Too good, which is why they killed him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she said next. She said, "Some men don't age the way others do, Laura, not because they're immortal, but because identities are recycled, protected, erased." I stared at her. I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "Daniel isn't one man. Daniel is a role, a designation, an assignment that gets passed down or reassigned depending on the operation." I felt like I was going to be sick. I said, "You're telling me my husband isn't real?" She said, "I'm telling you the person you married has been many people, and none of them are who they say they are." She told me that the organization my father was investigating didn't just destroy evidence. They embedded themselves in people's lives. They created relationships, marriages, friendships. They put agents in place years before they were needed, just in case. My mother said she'd suspected for years that someone was watching me, but she didn't know who or how close they were. She said, "When you told me you were marrying a civil engineer named Daniel Whitman, I almost collapsed." Whitman, the same last name. Do you understand how deliberate that was? How calculated? I shook my head. I couldn't process it. I couldn't make it make sense. She gave me a name. Detective Aaron Cole. She said he was retired now, living just outside Columbus, and that he was one of the few people my father had trusted. She said, "He knows things I don't. Things your father kept from me to keep me safe. If you want the full truth, you need to talk to him." I asked her why she didn't go to him herself. She said, "Because I was too afraid of what he'd confirm." I drove to Columbus that same afternoon. Aaron Cole lived in a small house with a fenced yard and a dog that barked when I pulled into the driveway. He was older, mid-70s, with gray hair and the kind of sharp eyes that told me he was still a detective in every way that mattered. I told him who I was. He didn't look surprised. He said, "I've been waiting for you to show up for about 5 years now." We sat on his porch and he told me everything my mother couldn't. He confirmed the impossible. Records erased. Faces reused. Marriages embedded for surveillance. He said the organization my father was investigating had been doing this since the 70s. They called them anchors. People planted in the lives of targets or the families of targets, just waiting, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. The anchor's job was to observe, report, and if necessary, intervene. He said, "Your husband, or whoever he is, was assigned to you long before you ever met him. That coffee shop that spilled latte, none of it was an accident." I asked Aaron if Daniel had killed my father. He said he didn't think so, but he couldn't be sure. He said, "The man you know as Daniel has been associated with at least 3 identities that we've tracked. And in every case, the people around him ended up either dead or disappeared." I felt my stomach turn. I asked, "Am I going to disappear?" Aaron looked at me with something that might have been pity. He said, "Not if they still need you." I confronted Daniel that night. I walked into our apartment and he was sitting on the couch, reading a book like it was any other evening. I stood in the doorway and said, "I know what you are." He looked up slowly. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't seem worried. He just closed the book, set it on the coffee table, and said, "Okay." I said, "You were assigned to observe me. You've been watching my family for years. You married me because it was your job." He didn't deny it. He just nodded. He said, "I was assigned to observe. Then I chose to stay." I started crying. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. I said, "Did you ever love me? Was any of it real?" He stood up and walked toward me and I backed away. He stopped. He looked at me with those same calm, steady eyes I'd once found comforting. And he said, "Love makes people sloppy, Laura, and I couldn't afford to be sloppy." That's when I realized it. I was never meant to be a wife. I was never meant to be a partner. I was leverage. I was a tool. I was a way to keep tabs on my mother and whatever information my father had left behind. I asked him what happened next. I asked him if he was going to kill me. He said, "That's not my call." I said, "Whose call is it?" He didn't answer. We stood there in silence, 2 people who'd shared a bed and a life and a last name, and I realized I didn't know him at all. I never had. And then my phone rang. It was a blocked number. I answered. Henry Blake's voice said, "We need to meet again tomorrow, 2 p.m. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because they want to talk. And this time they're asking you to bring Daniel." I'm 47 years old now, and I still check the locks on my doors twice every night before I go to bed. Once when the sun goes down, and once right before I turn off the lights. My mother lives with me. She moved in 3 years ago. Not because she's old or sick, but because neither of us can stand to be alone anymore. We don't talk about Daniel much. His name feels like a curse. We're afraid to speak out loud. Officially, he was reassigned. That's what Aaron Cole told me when I called him 6 months after that final confrontation. Reassigned to another operation, another life, another identity. Unofficially, Aaron said something else. He said, "People like him don't retire, Laura. They get erased when they're no longer useful." I don't know if Daniel is alive. I don't know if he ever thinks about me, about the years we spent together, about the lie we called a marriage. Some nights I wonder if he was ever in that apartment at all, or if I imagined the whole thing. But then I see the wedding photos I keep in a box under my bed, and I know it was real. At least it was real to me. That's the cruelest part. My love was real. His was a job. I started this storytelling channel 2 years ago. I tell other people's stories mostly. True stories. Complicated stories. Stories about betrayal and survival and the things people do when they're backed into corners. But really, I'm preparing, because controlling the narrative is the only power I have left. If they come for me, if something happens, at least there will be a record. At least someone will know my story didn't end the way they wanted it to. My mother spends most of her days in the garden. She plants things obsessively. Tomatoes, roses, herbs I've never heard of. I think it's her way of creating something that can't be taken away. Something that grows instead of disappearing. We don't talk about my father much either. But sometimes, late at night when neither of us can sleep, we sit in the kitchen and she tells me small things. How he used to hum while he worked. How he'd leave notes hidden around the house for her to find. How he died believing he was protecting us. She cries when she says that last part, because he didn't protect us. He just handed us a legacy of paranoia and surveillance and lives that never belonged to us. Last week, something changed. I came home from the grocery store and found an envelope on my doorstep. No postage. No return address. Just my name written in block letters across the front. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside was a USB drive. Small, black, unremarkable. And a note. The note was typed, not handwritten. It said, "You've been watching the past. Now watch the future." I should have thrown it away. I should have called Aaron. I should have taken it to the police. Though I know from experience that wouldn't have done any good. But I didn't do any of those things. I went inside, locked the door twice, and plugged the USB drive into my laptop. My mother was upstairs. I didn't tell her. I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted to protect her the way she'd tried to protect me. Maybe because I was tired of sharing every piece of terror that walked into my life. The footage loaded slowly. When it finally appeared on my screen, I felt my entire body go cold. It showed the exterior of Ridgeway Café, the same cafe where this all started. The same faded sign, the same tinted windows. But the timestamp in the corner wasn't from the past. It was from tomorrow, December 21st, 2025. 2:15 p.m. and then I watched myself walk into frame. Not someone who looked like me. Me, wearing a jacket I own, carrying the bag I carry, my hair the same length it is right now. I watched myself pause at the door, look around like I was checking to see if anyone was watching, and then push it open and walk inside. The footage cut to an interior camera. I watched myself sit down at a table near the back, the same table where my mother had sat in 1996. I watched myself wait, and then I watched someone approach. I couldn't see their face. The camera angle was wrong, but I watched myself stand up. I watched myself reach for something on the table, and then the footage ended, just like that. Black screen, no explanation, no context, just me, walking into a place I haven't decided to go to, doing something I haven't decided to do, in a future that hasn't happened yet. I sat there staring at the blank screen for I don't know how long. My mother came downstairs and asked if I was okay. I closed the laptop and told her I was fine. I'm not fine. I haven't been fine in years. But what else do you say when the cameras are still rolling and the people behind them are showing you that they're always 3 steps ahead? What else do you say when you realize your life isn't your own, and maybe it never was? I haven't decided whether I'll go to the cafe tomorrow. Part of me thinks if I don't show up, if I stay home and lock the doors and pretend I never saw that footage, maybe the future will change. Maybe I can break whatever chain they've wrapped around me. But another part of me knows it doesn't work that way. They've already seen me there. They've already recorded it, which means it's already happened in some version of reality I don't understand. I run this channel because I need people to hear me. I need someone out there to know that if this story ends, if I disappear the way my father disappeared, the way Daniel disappeared, it didn't begin with the cafe. It didn't begin with a phone call or a piece of footage or a USB drive left on my doorstep. It began with a mother who tried to protect her daughter from a truth that refuses to stay hidden. It began with a little girl in Dayton, Ohio, who noticed things adults thought they could keep secret. It began the moment my father decided to investigate people who don't forgive being investigated. Tomorrow is December 21st. In a few hours, I'll have to decide. Do I walk into that cafe and play the role they've already filmed? Or do I stay home and wait for whatever comes next? I don't know which choice is the right one. I don't know if there is a right one. All I know is that somewhere, right now, the cameras are still rolling, and someone is watching. They're always watching.